This is a book about government food, and it's about who the British government fed and why it chose these populations and not others. And it really had many starting points as a historical research project. Some of these were personal, but some were professional. And its origins really date back to my graduate school career when I read the memoir of the British historian Carolyn Steedman. And growing up in the 1950s, she claimed, I think I would be a very different person now if orange juice and milk and dinners at school hadn't told me in a covert way that I had a right to exist, was worth something. And that food provided by the government could instill in a child a sense of self-worth was really a revelation to me. I grew up in the context of Canada's welfare state, and my parents had handed me the family allowance check each month as pocket money. And so I also knew growing up that the state wanted me to have milk and bread. But I really hadn't needed that to make me realize that I mattered, that I had this right to exist. So I embarked on this project really to explore both what the British government thought it was doing when it fed subjects it identified as worthy, and what state feeding really meant, both to those who used these services, but also to those who refused the services. So this book starts in the workhouses of the 1830s that were actually built to curb government spending on poor relief by discouraging the poor from entering them. And in these institutions, the poor were fed the cheapest food possible, and they were denied a roast beef Christmas dinner, even when this was funded by charitable donors. And the book ends with the post-war welfare state, whose ideology of poverty was really diametrically opposed to the workhouse, and which provided this free and subsidized orange juice to children like Steedman. And along the way, I also explore government food programs for prisoners, for famine victims, for prisoners of war, for school children, and for civilians on the World War II home front. But it's important to note that this book doesn't make a case for progress. And in fact, I think quite the opposite is true. I found that even when central government officials denied those workhouse inmates roast beef, liberal quantities of this were often provided by local government officials who deliberately thumbed their noses at these directives emanating from London. But conversely, I discovered that this welfare orange juice was made possible through stimulating the economy of the West Indian colonies, who were essentially coerced into producing a concentrated orange juice product whose only buyer was the British government. When a few years into the scheme, the Conservative government decided that it no longer wished to support either a colonial industry or families who they declared could afford to buy their own vitamin foods, Her Majesty's government denied any responsibility for supporting the West Indian orange juice industry that it had started precisely to serve the needs of the welfare state. So while this book does move chronologically, it doesn't map a particularly progressive story of identifying and then feeding the most needy members of society. And in many respects, each chapter can stand alone, telling a separate story of government intervention in the food supply. And this is largely because each case did appear like a brand new problem for the government actors involved to solve. Britain had no permanent Ministry of Food or other agency responsible for feeding the people. And so it delegated these responsibilities anew each time the state decided to take some responsibility for institutional feeding or for targeted attempts to mitigate either hunger or malnutrition. So there's a bewildering array of government departments that appear in this book, few of which seem to communicate at all with each other. They didn't transfer their knowledge particularly effectively, and they didn't attempt to treat either hunger or later malnutrition as systemic problems. But perhaps the biggest surprise to me in researching and writing this book was not so much the disorder within the government around feeding practices and policies. It was really how little science mattered. What we have come to call the nutritional sciences began to develop around the middle of the 19th century. And perhaps unsurprisingly, these had little impact on the government's institutional feeding, which continued really to be governed by economics and political ideologies. And as I discovered, firm ideas about gender and race. But what is perhaps more surprising is that neither the discovery of the calorie nor the wealth of nutritional studies that emerged in the interwar period shaped government programs. Even when it was clearly cheaper and more expedient to follow the latest nutritional science, the British government often privileged cultural eating habits and or political ideologies when deciding who should be fed what. For example, during World War II, the British government prioritized sending white bread to prisoners of war rather than the more nutritious wholemeal bread. And then it refused to send them calorie-heavy and protein-rich canned fish products because they were perceived as distasteful to the English palate. During the Depression, cold sandwiches served with milk and fresh fruit were much cheaper, and they provided more nutrition than the sloppy cooked dinners served to school children. But the government argued that a hot midday meal was more culturally appropriate. Once they had decided to defund the welfare orange juice program, government officials actually manipulated the scientific data on vitamin C to support their actions. So because neither science nor economics really ever fully accounted for decisions around state feeding, I really treat each of the case studies in this book as a unique problem to be solved. Why feed this population? Why now? And these types of questions really help me to understand the emergence of particular food policies in their historical contexts. But this is a book as much about how these policies actually played out in practice. The historian John Brewer once said that there were two kinds of historians, parachutists and truffle picks. So I'm not the parachutist. The bird's eye view, the large scale, the vast amounts of time and space, the big narratives, these are not things I think I'm particularly good at because I'm a truffle pig. And I live in archives and I dig through heaps of government memos, reports, scrawled minutes and notes, what I think of as the kind of flotsam and jetsam of government decision making. And I really work from these scraps of paper up, using a lot of material that was never intended to survive, but which really lays bare both the conscious and the unconscious motivations behind many of the state directives. And it was really only through rifling through 300 boxes of Board of Education materials on school meals that I could really see that glaring difference between the official narrative of malnutrition and school meals in the 1930s and how the government's policies around the feeding of school children really actually played out in practice. And this is also how you find those gems, like the menu for a school meal in Rochdale in May of 1939, which included steamed fig pudding with shite sauce. So Many Mouths is about the cultural politics of food then. It's a study of what stimulated the modern British state from the 1830s to the 1960s to target some subjects for feeding, but not others. But it's really equally about those who use these services, those who refuse these services. And it's at heart about the messiness of food fights, precisely because what we eat and who decides what we eat is both materially and culturally significant. So what I want to do now is do two really short readings from the book in order really to give you a sense of the kinds of stories that it tells. And the first is about the decision made in the 1890s to feed child famine victims in India at what were called kitchens. And these were relief centers that provided cooked food to the children of adults who were employed for wages on the public works projects, which provided the major form of government famine relief. And that the colonial government provided cooked food as a form of famine relief alongside this work for wages has been neglected by historians. And I'm particularly grateful to the historian Aidan Forth, who first introduced me to the children's kitchens in particular. So that's our first episode. So in the context of famine relief, in the 1890s, the colonial state attempted to act in loco parentis, deciding that the only way to save, quote, the lives of the field laborers of the future was to provide them cooked food and supervise their meals. Under the banner of rendering a service to humanity, administrators thus assumed responsibility themselves for feeding their child units, a term that was frequently used when calculating the relief accounts. This was a means to shore up the next generation of agricultural laborers who would be responsible for producing revenue for the government of India. By the 1890s, the collective wisdom that Indian parents could not be trusted to care for their offspring gained momentum through constant repetition by British and Indian officials and observers alike, to such an extent that this statement became enshrined in the famine codes of each province. They declared that experience having shown that starving parents very often cannot safely be entrusted with the means of relieving their children in times of famine, it is essential, where this is apprehended, that a daily supply of cooked food be issued to them under proper supervision. Only 2 witnesses before the 1898 Famine Commission testified that parents fed their children well and would rather starve themselves than see their offspring suffer. Many others just parroted what had by this time become a well-known fact that rarely needed to be elaborated or supported, precisely because it was consistent with well-established colonial narratives of the Indian family, that Indian parents were inherently selfish, negligent, and cruel, preferring to feed themselves even at the expense of their emaciated children. Many proponents of kitchens accused parents of grossly neglecting or deliberately starving their children so that they themselves could consume this portion of the family meal or save the child allowance for future use. Reports came from all over India during the 1896-7 famine that Indians would allow their children to starve before they would starve themselves, and would even buy tobacco before provisioning their offspring. The acting collector of Ganjam asserted that the famine code did not adequately cover the case of these children who were deliberately starved by their parents in order that they may receive the doles, which the parents, themselves fairly well nourished and able to work, consume. Official accounts of the 1896-7 famine reiterated this point. T.W. Holderness, the Deputy Secretary to the Government of India, argued that kitchens were frequently substituted for cash doles because of the neglect of parents to feed their children, though receiving money for this food. It was found that they either spent the extra allowance on themselves, he remarked, or saved it against the day when the works would be closed. This was an ironic statement, given how much value those who favored market solutions placed on saving for a rainy, or in this case, non-rainy day. A report of this famine in the northwestern provinces and Awadh similarly maintained that it was sometimes found necessary to provide relief in the shape of cooked food for children neglected and starved by their parents, who appropriate the cash doles for their own uses. In the 1896 Mysore Famine Code, cash allowances were permitted in some cases, but officers were alerted that the danger of this practice must be constantly borne in mind. They were warned to specially inspect the children and dependents so relieved, and if the health and strength of many of them appear to be deteriorating, to replace the payments with cooked food from kitchens. Relief officers quickly built consensus during this famine around the substitution of cooked food for cash doles. Now, it was not merely that cooked food be substituted for cash, but that it should be issued to children under proper supervision. When children were fed at various institutions, a special watchfulness was required, argued an official report, for children are liable to have the food snatched from them by other children or by adults, or may be induced by fear to save a part of it to give to their parents. For this reason, the children had to be constantly supervised by the authorities and by specially selected female nursery supervisors, who ensured the children ate their food themselves and did not remove any from the kitchens. The state thus deliberately removed the children from their parents for the purposes of feeding, treating them as individual units of future manpower that needed to be sustained rather than as part of a mutually dependent family. The next bit I'm going to read is from my chapter on British restaurants. And these were not-for-profit canteens that were run by local authorities with financial help from the Ministry of Food during World War II. And they were part of a much larger initiative to use various forms of communal feeding during the war. And British restaurants were introduced very explicitly to cater to those living just above the poverty line in order to keep up their morale during wartime by making cheap cooked food readily available at a moment when food was clearly perceived as an important weapon of war. And I'm going to start by referencing John Boyd Orr, who is one of the leading nutritionists in Britain at this time and who was an advisor to Churchill's kind of scientific committee on feeding. So although Orr had argued that the poor were not particularly susceptible to propaganda and chose to consume food that was priced within their means, what to name these new institutions was of paramount concern to a range of government officials who were well aware of the importance of public relations and the resistance to institutions of this nature. In the summer and autumn of 1940, the terms national restaurants, national kitchens, people's restaurants, community feeding centers, and communal feeding centers were all being used indiscriminately to refer to non-emergency services that could undertake day-to-day feeding operations. Marshall, who's the PR guy for the Ministry of Food, Marshall insisted that an alternative to communal feeding be coined, as this term repels a great many people. He favored something more inspired that could convey a combined sense of happiness and friendliness. The Minister of Food, Woolton, concurred that the term community feeding needed to be killed because of its inherent coldness. According to the state's own wartime social survey, housewives in Glasgow objected to the term communal precisely because it implied a soup kitchen. Londoners, on the other hand, disliked the term kitchens for exactly the same reason. The government's adoption of the term community kitchens in November of 1940 was as equally problematic as communal feeding center. Indeed, some even objected to the more innocuous term community. The WVS, as a women's social group, argued that what these services were to be named was of vital importance if you were going to attract people to them. The title Community Feeding Center, this organization maintained, has little appeal for the individualistic Englishman. The other problem with the term communal was that it evoked Soviet forms of state control. In 1942, F. LeGros Clark, a leading expert on nutrition who had lobbied for an expansion of school meals during the 1930s, published a pamphlet detailing the Russian system of collective feeding. He entitled it Soviet Forms in Communal Feeding. His use of the term communal in this context reveals the strong association between this particular phrase and communist regimes. And I should just pause and say that the government was instituting these experimental communal feeding centers based on a model that had been introduced and experimented with by a woman by the name of Flora Solomon, who worked for the department store Marks and Spencer and had been pioneering these communal kitchens in working class neighborhoods. So Woolton had chastised Solomon, who was a Russian emigre, for naming her feeding center a communal restaurant. "Are you a communist?" he queried. In July of 1941, Mass Observation, which sought to compile a non-governmental archive of everyday wartime experiences, reported that the term communal kitchen had been replaced precisely because some sensitive people had objected to the word communal. It was quick to note, however, that this was before Russia entered the war as Britain's ally. Presumably afterward, the British government needed itself to be more sensitive about its aversion to communism, though by this time the term communal had officially been retired. Some suggestions for a better name came both from local authorities and from the public. Council Cafeteria, Comfy Cafe, Potluck Depot, Victory Restaurant, Cookery Nook, Freedom Restaurant, which sounds actually right now very American. That would be an American term. Wooltaron, which is a play on of Lord Woolton's name. Blitzerant, and Family Fair Centers, among others. In the end, it was Churchill himself who suggested the term British restaurant. And I know as a British historian, I'm supposed to have a good Churchill imitation, and I can do that. Like "we will fight them on the beaches" speech, but I can't do this in a good Churchill voice, so bear with me. "I hope the term communal feeding centers is not going to be adopted," he wrote to Woolton. "It is an odious expression, suggestive of communism and the workhouse. I suggest you call them British restaurants. Everybody associates the word restaurant with a good meal, and they may as well have the name if they cannot get anything else." The Ministry of Food thus officially adopted the name British Restaurants in April of 1941 and required it to be used by all local authorities except the London County Council, which was allowed to retain the term Londoners' Meal Service, having taken a firm stand on the importance of catering to local sensibilities. In naming them British restaurants, Churchill implied that the government could both invoke the wartime national spirit and capitalize on consumer expectations regarding the cultural cachet of dining out. In fact, the Ministry of Food had to overcome considerable public resistance to eating outside the home, which until the war had been a practice largely confined to the middle and upper classes. One of the problems posed by the communal feeding center was that it challenged the tradition of the home meal as a central part of English home life. In initial discussions about communal feeding, government officials feared that it would be extremely difficult to chip away at the long-established working-class habit of eating meals at home. Solomon similarly argued that eating out was so foreign to the British people that it could be likened to replacing the brick walls of the Albert Hall with glass and turning the place into a nudist colony. I am more than happy and very excited, in fact, to take your questions.
Hello, Nadia. Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I'm just going to take advantage of my privilege as the introducer, just to ask a question of my own. And I wondered if you could say a little bit. Obviously, your book is published into the pandemic and is being read and responded to at a very particular moment of increased food poverty. We're seeing real reliance and dependence on food banks, and that the sort of need for feeding for children over the summer, so the sort of free school meals that we touched on earlier. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the sort of historical precedents for that you've covered in your book.
Yeah, so of course, this is one of the things the pandemic has kind of laid bare for us is this kind of global problem of food insecurity and food supply that's really coming home to roost in nations that have considered themselves sort of Western and developed and haven't seen themselves to have these problems. The idea of school feeding dates back to 1906, which is when the emergence of the school meal was introduced, and again, aimed at poor children, aimed at people living at or below the poverty line. And actually, it was very early that the British government solved the problem of the summertime feeding. And already by 1914, that ability to feed children at school had been amended so that local school districts could start to feed children also over the summer and winter holidays. So as early as 1914, the government had a mechanism in place for feeding children over school holidays so that there wasn't these kind of gaps in a family's budget, because most families were using the school meal in this period of time to kind of, to bridge the shortfalls in their budgets. And so the British government had already solved that problem by 1914, and that they are choosing not to do that now if there's a sense that they don't want to. There is much historical precedent for doing that. And this is part of the argument of my book, is that the British government isn't actually super interested in either historical precedent or talking across, departments to each other, because the mechanism had been in place since 1914 to feed children over the summer. And I also think it's interesting to note that the government hasn't done an official inquiry into food insecurity until I think just last year. 2019, there was a big report that was lobbied for and released that determined, I think the statistic was that about 10% of the British population could be classed as hungry, which suggests that this is not a problem that's been solved, or perhaps that the government has even attempted to solve.
Yes, and it's one that predates the pandemic.
Yes, certainly predates the pandemic, but that this is laying bare. I am not seeing my question. I see that there is a question here, but I'm not seeing what it is.
No problem, Nadia. I'll read it out to you now. Bear with me a second. We've got a couple actually. So the first one, do you have a sense for how much time Churchill and other high government officials allocated to this issue in light of the time demands of the war effort?
So one of the quite exciting things about writing this book was that I was able to really, once I'd written all the chapters, and they were obviously written out of order, and the Second World War chapter was the one I wrote second. I thought it was going to be the end of the book, so I wrote the first chapter and the last chapter, or what I thought was going to be the last chapter. And it was very clear in the context of writing this chapter on British restaurants that the government really invested in its scientific advisors, that the people working for the Ministry of Food on the Scientific Council, also that was advising Churchill and the War Cabinet, actually cared about nutrition and were trying to use these British restaurants to both solve the food problem during the war, but what they hoped was to kind of build new food habits that might continue in the post-war period. And once I'd gone back and written the rest of the book, I realized this is the moment. The war is actually the moment when the British government seems to care for the first time about investing in the sciences of food and actually investing the time and money into making sure the population as a whole is fed. And they're absolutely shocked to find how many people are using these British restaurants, that they had intended it. It was targeted for the working poor. Many people think that these were targeted for the blitzed population, but that is actually not true. They were meant for the working poor. They were meant to boost morale. But it turned out that almost the whole population, except the extremely elite classes, were using these. And there is a lot of energy and effort in the Ministry of Food and in that kind of scientific council that's advising the War Cabinet around this issue of needing to keep kind of nutrition levels high during the war. And in part, this is because by the Second World War, they had understood that the massive deaths in the flu epidemic of 1918 to 1920 had in part likely been caused by malnutrition that had been, ever present during the First World War and immediately afterwards. So they were alive to the fact that this was a morale issue, but it was also a health issue that was going to have large-scale repercussions during the war, but also after the war. So it's really World War II that I can see that moment where people actually are investing in the sciences of food for the purposes both of getting through this emergency crisis where food is an issue, but also thinking ahead to beyond the war as well.
Thank you. We have a number of questions come in now, so I'll read out the next one. So this one says, thanks very much for this fascinating discussion of the naming of the British restaurant in the context of British working class dissociation from eating out. I was wondering if there was any attempt to build on the working class tradition of the pie shop or the fish and chippy, both working class examples of eating out at home as a model for feeding people.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. So I have two answers for that. The first is that, and I didn't work on this, but it came by me repeatedly in the archive, that there was a pie scheme that I think was put into place for particularly the mining districts during World War II. So because they understood that miners obviously needed to eat at work, they were sending pies into those communities as a way to kind of boost nutrition and give people more food. So there is an attempt to build on the pie eating. The fish and chips question is really interesting. And I write a little tiny bit about this in an article that I took out some material on the British restaurant, put it into an article on gender and the family and the British restaurant, because I didn't have space to include it in the book. But initially, in those very early 1940 discussions about what should be served in these British restaurants, someone raises the issue of whether they should serve fish and chips. And Flora Solomon, who I discussed briefly, who had really kind of experimented with these canteens, and which had actually been funded by Simon Marks of Marks and Spencer, had given her money to do this. She determined really quickly that the people using her canteen, who are all working class people, did not want, explicitly did not want fish and chips to be served. That they felt that was actually a stereotype of what working class people ate, and that working class people often ate that because it was cheap and convenient rather than because it was a choice. And what they wanted was some form of nutritious, healthy cooked food. So she actually shut that down pretty early, and she thought of herself as kind of storming into the Ministry of Food, telling them they needed these British restaurants, and kind of pushing them to build them up. And so she was kind of an informal advisor, and she had really shut down this notion then that fish and chips was appropriate food for the working classes, because she did claim they did not want this. And I found that totally fascinating.
Thank you. So the next question is, it would be interesting to hear how feeding children is organised in other European countries like France or Germany, and how this relates to the compact between family and state, the French and Scandinavians with summer camps, etc. Also, have older people become more prominent in distribution?
Okay, so those are two questions. And I have not done research on kind of European school feeding, but I can speak to its lack of influence on British school feeding. So when school feeding was introduced around 1906, it was you didn't have to institute it. It was up to local authorities whether they wanted to do it or not. And so there was some research that was done into what other European nations were doing, some studies of France in particular and of Italy. But that knowledge was not transferred. So the government was aware of these other programs in other European countries, but did not believe, and this I see this throughout the book in terms of all the populations I'm dealing with, did not believe that Europe was a good model for Britain, that Britain was different, that actually British bodies were different. In discussions over prison feeding, there's quite explicit discussion of the German body being different than the British body, and therefore you can't use German science. So there's this constant refrain that what goes on the European continent is not applicable to Britain. Britain's a different place with a different culture and different eating habits. And the place I really saw this come home to roost was in relationship to something called the Oslo breakfast. And in the 1920s, the Oslo public school system, using public in the way that we do in North America, state school system, introduced this meal for school children. It was called a breakfast, but it might be served at lunchtime as well. And it was believed to be the most nutritionally, the best nutritious meal for children that was still affordable. And it included wholemeal bread, butter, cheese, some kind of fresh green, like a salad green, like watercress, a piece of fresh fruit, and milk. And it had been shown in studies in Norway, this reason it's called the Oslo breakfast, that this had led to really enormous growth in school children, improvements in health, in stature, in weight gain. And this was really well-known knowledge in the 1920s that the British government essentially refused to adopt. And it wasn't until 1939, really just right on the eve of the war, that the British government said, oh yes, this would probably be a decent meal to give to school children. The advantage to it also is that it's really cheap. It doesn't require any labor involved. Children can be provided this meal by school teachers, and it doesn't require any storage or fuel to cook it. So it was a very affordable and nutritious meal. But it's not till 1939 that the British government says, Okay, let's do that. And it actually becomes, the Oslo breakfast becomes the basis for the initial discussions about what should be served in British restaurants. John Boyd Orr is a big fan of the Oslo breakfast, and he tries to say this is the meal we should serve in British restaurants. But of course, that's quickly replaced by the idea that it needs to be some kind of appealing hot dinner that's comforting to and familiar foods. The second question was about the elderly. What's missing from this book, because I couldn't find it, I searched and searched and searched for it, was some attention to the elderly, some attempt to feed the elderly. And of course, we have old age pensions in Britain from 1908, but that's cash. And I was really looking for food. The reason I chose these case studies is because they were instances where actual food was being given, not just money for food. And I did not find any cases in which the government gave food to the elderly. I found a case that looked like it might be worth exploring about allotment gardens, making allotment gardens available, but it seemed in the end that that was a scheme from the Quakers, the Society of Friends, that the government supported a little bit, but it wasn't a government scheme. So I think it's really interesting that the elderly don't seem to be targeted in this period for feeding.
Great, thank you. So the next one says, congratulations, Nadia. I'm intrigued by the chapter design of your exciting new book. Can you say something about how you figured out the chronological contours of this study, or perhaps about your experience moving into the 20th century as someone trained as a Victorianist?
Yes, I can speak to both of those things. So the book actually, when I wrote, so the first chapter of the book, which is about the refusal to serve roast beef at Christmas in workhouses, actually started as the first chapter of a different book, which was going to be about beef and British identity. And it was going to be a Victorianist book. It was all about the 19th century. And after I'd finished writing the chapter, really didn't care about the beef anymore, but I just was drawn into this story of the state, and really went back to my initial interest with this idea of like food and self-worth and citizenship. And so the first chapter was, came out of this other project. And once I decided, though, what this book was really about, this state, what in my mind has always been called state feeding, that fell out of the eventual title of the book, but in my mind, this was a state feeding project. I went looking for other cases, and I stumbled into the British restaurant. So I wrote that thinking it was going to be the last chapter of this book, because I realized that I needed to, if I was going to tell the story of state food, it needed to be a much bigger story than just a 19th century story. I needed to get at least to the edge of the welfare state. And then in researching the British restaurant, the story of orange juice actually begins during World War II. And so it was in all the files of the British restaurant were these references constantly to this thing called the vitamin scheme, or the welfare foods program, which was the orange juice. And so I had never heard of this welfare food scheme. And so that became the next project. And then I realized the book really needed to end with this story of the welfare state, which was an incredibly sad story for me, because it was about the welfare state being inherently a colonial institution built upon the back of West Indian industry. And that seemed like the right place to end. And there was also this kind of magical moment when I realized that the welfare food scheme and the orange juice was withdrawn the year that I was born, and I was born in the UK. So in my mind, the whole time I was writing that, the chapter was called Enoch Powell Stole My Orange Juice, because he's the one who eventually decided that program should be killed. So the end point became a really natural ending point for me. And then the idea was to work backwards and fill in what would the other stories be. And I was really looking for stories that came to me from the archive. As I said, I'm this truffle pig, so it's really rare for me that I have an idea and then I go find it. It's much more frequent that the ideas try to chase me around the archive until I grab them. And so all the stories from this book came from just kind of throwing terms into the National Archives around food and meals, and seeing what stories came up as having a lot of paperwork. And that was really key. What was troubling the state? What was problematic for the state? And I knew the prison would have to be in there with the workhouse as an institution. The prisoner of war story really found me. I was hoping to work on conscientious objectors and couldn't find anything. And perhaps the most exciting story for me was the story of school meals during the Depression, because I had thought I understood the school meal story until I really couldn't understand what was going on in the Depression. And it was that moment of not understanding what the government was trying to do. I had initially understood it was trying to identify malnourished children and feed them, which I thought was amazing, which was not what they were trying to do. That really stood out for me. So it was really a matter of trolling through kind of just really random food stuff in the National Archives and seeing what the government was really angry about, concerned about, irritated, anxious about, what left those paper trails. And the second point about working in the 20th century, I've thought about this a ton. And, I feel like many of us who thought about ourselves as Victorianists are doing some work in the 20th century. And I fell in love with the interwar period doing this book. That period really spoke to me. And I realized it's because all those problems of the Victorian period that Victorianists are so interested in, these questions of modernity, capitalism, poverty, are really playing out in the interwar period. The legacies of Victorianism are there. Also, people who work in the 20th century, you don't have to read anyone's handwriting. I mean, you get to read typewritten sources, which was a revelation to me. So the 20th century turned out to be really hard for me because I had to learn stuff, from scratch that I really didn't know. I didn't know anything about the 1960s, so I had to learn that stuff. But it's also really rewarding and exciting because I really understood the legacies of Victorianism and made sense to me. And so I don't know what my next project is. I'm working on some interwar stuff right now, kind of getting that bee out of my bonnet. But I hope to go and take the kind of work backwards, from where Victorianism goes back into the 19th century. But it was really fun and challenging, I think, as a 19th century historian, to be doing a lot of this work in the 20th century.
I have a next question that is, my grandpa remembered receiving turkey in a tin at Christmas time during World War II, sent by a charity from America to poor families in England. Do you cover charities in your book as well as government responses?
That's such a wonderful question. And one of the ways I think the British state has operated has been by delegating the work of the state to charities. And that's a very 19th century phenomenon. Things like the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the work of the state's job to protect children from cruelty and neglect is really delegated to a charity. So I think separating charities from the state is often really difficult. And the place where I saw that really playing out in this project was in my World War I chapter, that there are two charities during World War I that are sending parcels to prisoners of war. One replaces the other. And if you looked at them kind of from a distance, you would think of them as non-governmental organizations, as charities doing the work of sort of sending to needy people, in this case, prisoners of war, charitable food donations. But when you really get inside the government archives, you see that these are not non-governmental organizations. In part, they're funded by the Treasury, and they are overseen by the Foreign Office. So the Foreign Office is making certain kinds of decisions about how much food can be sent, who can get it, where the food can come from, who can send it, who's in charge of packing that food. This is really a government organization, but it has to be seen to be non-governmental as part of negotiations between the belligerent countries during the war. It can't be seen that the government is sending food because they're concerned then that the prisoner of war camps will reduce the official rations because they're being sponsored by their governments rather than by charities. So working out these two organizations and their relationship to the government was really interesting to me. I didn't do that work for World War II, but in the context of the World War I prisoner of war feeding, you could see the ways in which the government was saying, we have nothing to do with this. These are charitable donations being sent through the post. But in reality, they had everything to do with what that food was, where it went, and how much of it could be sent. That's a great and really important question. I think to understand the state, one has to also understand its relationship to charities and the way it used charities.
And another one that we've got is Margaret Thatcher was known as the milk snatcher for cutting free school milk. Does the liberal turn in the 1970s and 1980s mark a major break in the history of how food has been governed in Britain?
Can you say that second part again? I didn't hear the second part.
No problem. Does the neoliberal turn in the 1970s and 1980s mark a major break in the history of how food has been governed in Britain?
Oh, it's a great, and part of the Enoch Powell stole my orange juice was a kind of Margaret Thatcher milk snatcher. Couldn't make a really good rhyme, but that's exactly what I was thinking. And I think the answer is really no. I think what I found writing this book is that the moment of kind of break is that World War II moment, where there's this great optimism, right, about what the state is going to do and how it's going to follow through. But then what happens, I think, almost immediately when the Conservatives return to power in the 1950s, even after the welfare state has been launched, is this return to business as usual. And the business as usual is, like the government shouldn't really have to be responsible for the population. So I actually think that there's a kind of moment of optimism during World War II, and then there's stuff happening all the time on the local level that's more local governments caring for local populations. But that regardless of political party, there is this kind of sense, except for that optimistic moment of World War II, and it's bleeding over, with the Beveridge report and bleeding over into the establishment of the welfare state, that the government is going to invest in your health and nutrition. That is a kind of that is a break in a kind of isolated moment. And there's the greater theme is really that the government isn't responsible for the population as a whole. It is only responsible for these targeted populations in very particular historical moments to solve a very specific problem.
Great. And another question. Do you have a sense that private caterers were unhappy that the government used the term restaurant? Or to put it another way, did the government worry that they were moving into an area that should be handled by the market?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a really important question. And there's two answers to that question. And we're talking about the British restaurant here. So the government stressed over and over again that these were not subsidized canteens, that they were not for profit. And their distinction was that the intention of these restaurants was not necessarily to make money, but it was critical that they not lose money. So if they lost money, they were closed. They were not government subsidized. So what that meant is the amount that they took in for the meals had to cover the costs of the food, the labor, the rent, if there was some rent, all of those things. So the government said, these are not subsidized places, they're not for profit. It's a little bit disingenuous because often they were set up in requisition buildings, so they didn't have to pay for rent. But most of the time, they had paid labor. They were not staffed by volunteers. There is some WVS volunteership here, but mostly these are paid staff. And so the government's official position was that these were not government subsidized restaurants, and therefore they were not necessarily competing with commercial businesses. The second point they made was that they were tended to be opened in areas that were not already well situated with cafes, with commercial businesses, so that they were filling a need by going into what we might call food deserts now. So that was the government's official position on this, why this was not a form of municipal trading. These were businesses that had to be run on business lines, otherwise they'd be closed by the Ministry of Food, that they were not actually competing with established restaurants. Nonetheless, many restaurant owners were very much opposed to these institutions, argued against them, felt that this was either fascist on the one hand or socialist on the other, and objected to both of these concepts. And there was great debates over this as part of municipal trading. However, there was another group of restaurant owners who came out in favor of them, because what they were saying was that this was a market solution. What you were doing was training working class people to pay money for hot cooked meals served in public. And so what I found so fascinating about the British restaurant in the end was the ways in which it was adopted by people on both the left and the right. That this was both something that people who were proponents of the welfare state argued should carry forward into the welfare state of the post-war period, but also more conservatives and people who favored market solutions argued we're training new consumers. And so they were able to appeal to both of these populations. And I was really surprised to find so many restaurant owners saying this is a good thing for us. You know, after the war, people will come and eat at our places as well. So it occupies this kind of really interesting position because it's supported by people who favor market solutions and by people who don't.
Next question, could you comment on whether the rationing and restrictions on food during the two wars actually improved the nutrition and health of the population, particularly the poorer?
Yes, so rationing is introduced in World War I really in the last months of the war, and I don't think it has a major effect. But I think it's important to note that the British population was fairly still well fed during World War I. If you compare, you know, what was going on in Britain in terms of access to food versus what was going on in Germany, you know, people during World War I in Germany, the civilian population were surviving on probably 1,000 calories a day, where people in Britain were eating close to 3,000. So in World War I, people's diets were pretty stable. I think it's really clear that rationing was really good for the working class population, as were British restaurants. And I think for the first time, working class people were having access to healthy, nutritious, inexpensive food, and were eating that food. And I think those habits really continue into the post-war period, and I think it makes a huge difference. The one thing that doesn't have a holdover is wholemeal bread. The national wheat meal loaf is despised by the population, and as soon as they can return to white bread, they do. But I think there's really no question that the Second World War and the rationing and the exposure to industrial canteens, to these British restaurants, to other forms of these communal feeding, and I should say the school meal, which finally comes into its own during World War II, really improves the health and nutrition of the poor segment of the population that we can really see has a lasting effect.
Great, thank you. I have another question. This is a fascinating book and presentation. I look forward to reading it. You began the presentation by stating this history is not driven by changes in scientific discourses or understandings, but do you see any compatibility between Vernon's argument about nutrition as an umbrella argument for food provision of a general population and your own discussion of cultural politics of specific episodes that, in some cases, seem to accommodate local cultural practices or ignore local practices?
Yeah, so James Vernon's book, Hunger, was also one of the inspirations for mine. It's a really important book. And I don't think I could have written my book without that book already being in place. And I think what James is arguing is making a larger argument about Britain sort of identifying hunger as a social problem to be solved and the state as one element in that story. But what he also argues is, you know, that these solutions are really precarious and really uneven. And so what I tried to do in my book is sort of provide, in some ways, a companion to that by drilling down into those cases to see how this works on the ground. So I think it is fair to say that the nutritional sciences make a difference, and they make a difference over the long run, but they don't necessarily make a difference in terms of government solutions to particular problems. And I think perhaps that's more surprising than it's not something I would have imagined when I started this book. And the place I really see it happening is in that World War II case, where the government does seem to really care about science and does seem to care about nutrition. And so what I'm hoping to do in this book is really see those moments of unevenness and precariousness and explain why that is by arguing that culture is still really significant for the state, that we think they're going to be driven only by budget and maybe by science, but really they're driven by these deep-seated notions about what food means culturally as well. So I see my book and his book sort of working together, sort of overlapping. His is a much larger scale. As I said, I'm the kind of truffle pig drill down into those specific moments. And so I hope that it works as a kind of companion to these cultural moments while respecting the bigger story and narrative that his book maps out for us.
And then I think we've got time for one more question. As a historian in Utah, do you see similarities between the history of government feeding over the period you cover and the same period in the US, or are there significant differences?
There are some interesting differences. The thing that really struck me as most interesting is that the story of school meals in the United States is a story of a social program introduced to support a failing agricultural industry. So the whole reason we have school meals in the United States was to help the agricultural sector. The reverse was true with the orange juice story, and I thought that was really interesting, that the colonial agricultural industry is jump-started to support a domestic social program. So it's sort of the opposite story. But what I've really been paying attention to in my state is school feeding over the summer. Again, we started there, so it's a nice place to end as well, that my state makes school meals or some form of something that looks like a school meal available to any child, no questions asked, throughout the summer at certain depots. So people have really recognized that the school is a way in the United States in particular to provide social programs that the state really doesn't provide in any other way. We are not a welfare state here. We don't have a lot of social programs, especially in a conservative state like mine. And so the school becomes the way to distribute resources to needy populations like children. And so I've noticed the school feeding happening over the summer. I've also noticed a movement, a discussion around lunch shaming, which is a big issue here, shaming children whose parents have not paid the bill for school lunches. And so that's been a major problem in the United States, and one that we're trying to confront in this moment where many more people are becoming reliant on these services.